You're all sorted. Welcome everyone. It's lovely to see a good crowd and friendly faces. And I think we'll have a good time together. And hopefully I don't go to sleep because I had a very late night. And when the computer decided to corrupt my documents, fortunately, after a little bit of desperate prayer and a couple of hours of fiddling, got it back again. So I'm very glad to be here on time this morning. I'm going to tell you a story today. It's historical, but hopefully not boring. It's about the change through centuries that have been driven by people of courage and commitment to a cause, far greater than their personal aggrandizement or grandizement, but fully dedicated to helping people live well. I think they're the kind of people Kiwis love and admire. The details are mostly a hidden story of my story and ignored by most history books, which focus on kings and empires, battles and war heroes, political intrigues and inventions, and sometimes philosophy. This story is how changes came to permeate the way people, mostly in the Western world, came to think about themselves, others, and how they and their leaders should act. The process of change took a very long time because the result was so radically different from 2,000 years previously. By the time we were born, most of these ideas were firmly embedded in most of our psyches. Our worldview, in fact, is so different now. So that first slide is entitled How We Came to Be Different and Have a Different Worldview. So what is worldview? This is the way a person understands and interprets the world around them. It includes their beliefs, values, ideas about life, people and reality, and it shapes how they think and act, who and what actions they admire, and what they believe about the spirit world as far as its overarching activity in this world. But our focus today is on values. Mostly they are things we'd like to see acted out consistently and perfectly, especially in Christians. So in everyone, including ourselves, but because of our flawed personalities, our inbuilt self-protection mechanisms, unfortunately, these values are never perfectly acted out, but they're aspirational, and it's what people would like to see in their community and their society. So they motivate us in our generation to do better, but it definitely wasn't always like that. And we're going to dive in, and I'm sure you'll find food for thought if I say something startling or you disagree with. But please hold it back in your back pocket until I'm through, and we can have questions and discussions later. So, where are we going? We're going to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was the powerhouse of the known world. Look at the geography that it covered before BC became AD. It had governors stationed in faraway places, ruling with an iron fist. Vast swathes of Western and Northern Europe had been conquered. The Persians, Greeks, and various others had had their turns at their empire building and being admired as the top dog, glorying in their conquests. In fact, in those days, it seemed to be the ultimate sport of the time, played between ambitious, hard men, which involved mountains of countless needless deaths in all sorts of cruel ways. Roman society was actually a very sick one. Even though they didn't see it as sick at all, they thought they were the bee's knees. To them, sick was only when they became weaker than another powerful enemy. What was Roman society actually like back then? People didn't value life as we did. They didn't see cruelty or injustice as unusual or unjustified. At the very least, the ruling class did not follow that. We're not quite sure about the underclasses because they they never appeared. They were nothing, and they had no writings. They were irrelevant, especially the slaves. And those underclasses followed the pattern of the day because they were living in a brutal society, and they became brutalized due to the fact that they needed to kill or be killed in survival. You know, it was apart from the empire, it was a tribal world, small tribes continually fighting for their ground and their survival. And you see it in recent times, you know, around the islands here. It was, tribal warfare was endemic. And so those underclasses found the greatest entertaining sport to watch was at the Colosseum, watching gladiators fighting to the death with betting systems, making it even more exciting than watching pathetic Christians be gored alive and eaten by lions. They also enjoyed a slow, steady sort of, Here my pages. We've got some slides here, just giving a little background of what the Romans really saw as their worldview, the cosmic order. Power, beauty, and strength reflect the favor of the gods. Weakness is a personal or spiritual failing. Their ultimate symbol is the triumph of Caesar, absolute domination, military conquest, and the violent torture and execution of enemies and criminals. The other feature they had was crucifixed people, often lining the Appian Way as a warning. This is your fate if you cross us. It was a very powerful message. Infanticide of babies, unwanted, deformed, or female newborns are routinely abandoned outdoors to die or be claimed as slaves. The underclass, including slaves are viewed as living tools, devoid of honor, legal rights, or bodily autonomy. Every male in the house had every right to penetrate women slaves at their leisure. Status of women. Now this is in the aristocracy of Roman society. Lower than their children. That's how they were looked at. They were producers of children, but they were higher than the pets. They had to ask permission from their husbands every time they left the house. They had no autonomy at all, and no say in any matter. Charity and welfare. Civic philanthropy aim was to enhance the donor status through public monuments, games, or buildings. It was all about their status, currying favor, and if they did something for the population, it was to curry favor in effect. You know, going back to the woman, men used prostitutes like going to the toilet. No one except the aristocrats could object to the rape of their daughters. It accepted that every master was entitled to use a slave as desired. Men were very often bisexual. Their saying was, a wife for producing kids, prostitutes and mistresses for sex, and little boys for love. Can you believe such things? It's so foreign to us. We're not like that, but they were. Sorry to get you down. Now, you know, I didn't have time for a joke. So instead, I thought I'd cheer you up now, just to highlight something. Because this sick society needed a slow, transforming, steady process to transform somehow miraculously, stage by stage, into a new society. This is a wondrous thing that you're going to see. Quite miraculous. How this ever apparently evolved without help, I don't know. Here comes a pupa coming out. Shell. Here comes the caterpillar. Onto the milkweed. Chomp, chomp, chomp. Furiously. Day and night. Goes through a process of a number of molds. You see the colors are changing. And then it miraculously produces a chemical that perfectly glues itself to a branch. Tight. And then a transforming process. It's self-dissolving its body into a thick soup of chemicals. It's gone. The chrysalis is building. And with time, as it changes, the miracle starts to happen. And the soup has become a thing of great beauty. And the proboscis comes out finally, unrolls in two pieces, and miraculously links in a kind of hinged joint, so it can then suck nectar out. And then there's a new phase. I'm going to just pause it so I could get my volume up, which screen. Maximum volume. Okay, I'll just turn up. John, can you wind that back main volume up? Do you know where to do it? And there?
That's only for the mic though. If I wind it up, it's the mic I want though.
Yeah.
Can you put the microphone on the left side?
Put the mic there. Good. Try that. That's one thing I didn't check. This is in Mexico, a very remote, small forest.
Oh, no.
Yeah, nice sound here. How about I do the commentary? They're wintering in this forest. Thick branches that look like leaves but are millions of butterflies. They come every third generation to this place from North America. Thousands of kilometers. No one knows how they get there, how they guide themselves there. The ones that arrive have never been there before. How did they know how to get there? And as it warms up in the day, it comes to life.
The bird is a camera, by the way. Yeah. Yeah.
It can get right in close. So.
There's a little drone.
Yes, clever.
You see how thick they are?
Little fans on
Literally millions. It's a unique place. It doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. This little forest, they only found it 30 years ago, I think, or 50 years ago.
it. Are those monarch butterflies?
How big is the area?
I don't know exactly, but when they're all up there, you can't get in there. They don't allow you in, so this little baby camera captured it uniquely for us. So every third generation, they don't produce an offspring. They save the strength for a flight of 6,000, I think, kilometers from Canada and the eastern board of America. They navigate over a long period of time, all meeting up at this forest in Mexico. And somehow the third generation knows what to do. But in between, back in the States, they just produce normally. And then they take off and head for Mexico. Isn't that interesting? Well, enter Jesus into the Roman Empire. A working man of the people. Worked as a builder, probably in the nearby large town, cosmopolitan place. There wasn't a lot of woodwork, but a lot of stonework and mud brickwork. And then at the age of 30, he started preaching a different message. Different to the many Messiah claimants who'd come before him. And their claim, I'm the Messiah, and if you follow me, we'll destroy the Romans, we'll free the nation. And it was a violent call, but his was not. His was a message totally different, and he confirmed that message by healing people and doing other miracles. As you see here, he loved children, he didn't look down on anybody. He preached a message of being a peacemaker, forgiveness because it's good for you. No revenge, please. That'll bring harmony to our country and our nation and our people and our families and our neighbors. And love others as you love yourself. Do to them as you would have them do to you. And this would make for a society that enjoys life to the maximum. Safety and love between people. See, he would say, see how I love, he didn't say it in words, but I hug the lepers because they too are loved by God. This is challenging stuff. Before he finally left his disciples, he washed their feet at their final supper. And he said, the tyrants of the world, they dominate. They lead by orders, by fear. But you are not to be like that. You are to follow my example. And then you who are become last, in the sense, will be first. So there's a challenge there too. He tolerated everybody, even those who'd come to him, confessing their sin. He accepted them. He loved them. He forgave them. The only people he didn't tolerate were religious hypocrites, the Pharisees. A lot of them were speaking with forked tongue. And he couldn't stand that, and he called them out on it. And he was pretty fierce about it. He said, if you put into action the things that I have told you, if you do that, you will be set free. You'll be free indeed. You'll be free from shame and guilt, uncertainty and anxieties, and worries about the next life and your next destination. You can live well, free of guilt. And, that is such an amazing promise, and it's so true. It's so true when you've experienced it and you know that. There's a deep inner peace. Like before I became a Christian, I never had. And the contrast, I can just, enjoy it every day. Every day it's a great day for me. Yes, he made all these claims, and he taught all these things, and he did the miraculous, and people loved him because they loved his teaching, but they loved it when he did the miracles in front of them. But he did say, you may not believe I'm saying I'm God, because he did, but at least believe in the miracles I did. He made these many claims to be equal to God. He said, I and the Father are one. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Heresy. Can you imagine the Pharisees of the one God? And that's it. How can you claim to be equal? And I can understand where they were coming from, because they were programmed that way. He said, you may not, he also said, beg your pardon, now, preaching this heresy more than once, he knew where this would end. But he didn't try and run away or escape. He knew it was coming. He'd gone to Jerusalem expecting it. He stayed where he was. He didn't try to run. He didn't try to avoid it. He suffered agony expecting it the night before in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he didn't offer any defense at his trial. So, as you could expect, that was the end. And that was suffering. Well, a well-documented miracle of resurrection was followed 40 days later. When 120 followers after that resurrection were together in a room filled with fear of authorities, but praying that Jesus would send what he promised, which was the Holy Spirit would come to them to replace his presence in the world by coming into many people at the same time. There were ordinary people down there in that room, fishermen, taxpayers, housewives, students, I guess, too. And they were there together praying in fear because the authorities they were sure were coming to take them as well. But also asking for that promise to come true. And they waited and prayed for quite a long time at this stage. And suddenly into that room came a powerful wind of something out of this world. An experience that filled them with joy, with excitement, a sense of relief from fear because they knew God had come to be with them. And it empowered them, and we read these stories very easily in the Bible, to do miracles in the same way Jesus did it. And they went out and preached that very day, and 3,000 people came to know God, believe in Jesus. They were converted to this new Jewish sect in that few hours after that. And you can read about that in the book of Acts in the Bible, written by a Greek doctor, educated man called Luke. It was a revelation of thought about values, and this was launched like an injection of powerful antidote into what was then a very cruel and sick world, far worse than it is today. A power beyond selling a conceptual good idea was needed, and the Holy Spirit had come to those first converts, was the thing that would provide the power behind the great ideas of Jesus. Now, into this point in time, I want to bring my expert source of information, because I'm not very clever and I'm not a historian, but this man is. He wrote this book, Dominion, 500 pages of detailed testimonies and stories of individuals through the last 2,000 years who led the change into a new way of living. And he came as an agnostic, non-believer, but a man deeply interested in ancient history. He'd written 8 books of all the different empires. He was fascinated by them from childhood. He went to church, but he wasn't very impressed because the people he admired were the power people. He said, when the story came up of Pilate and Jesus, he was really on the side of Pilate. He was strong. He had all the oomph behind him. Jesus was a nobody from the back blocks. And he couldn't really get his head around this. So that drove him into his career. He's won 5 premium awards in writing history books. This book was the book of the year in 2019. And there's actually something like, I had the number there somewhere. 500 ancient references of documents that are referenced in that book that he's read on our behalf, plus 280 from the Bible. So its great strength, according to this review, was not from a Christian. The great strength lies in how it makes the radical roots of Western values vivid and clear. Compassion and the fact that they were not going to inevitably develop naturally and are not universal givens is made clear, that there's something behind it. And the legacy of 2,000 years of evolution sparked by Christianity, the Western mindset shifted from ancient paganism to its modern worldview through a series of foundational events and conceptual earthquakes. So, his interest led to the book. It led to a lot of interest in the world of history and academics and people who, studied, who had never seen this before, literally. But all were very impressed. And I've read reviews by atheists as well, pretty acknowledging this has great factual backing. Of course, there were criticisms, and they said he was not nuanced enough, including Greek Stoicism and other things in the development of worldview, but they were really minor. Then there were criticism from the Christians who said he didn't mention the divine part of this whole story, the backing of the divine power, which is a bit of a history convention, apparently, writing it, but he wasn't that way inclined anyway. So, as we go into the story of these changes and what, the church people quietly were doing, I do want to acknowledge right away that terrible things were done in the name of Christ and in the churches. There was inquisitions, there was crusades, there was corrupt monasteries, there was authoritarian edicts to believers and non-believers alike that were totally opposite to Christ's teaching. So we'll get that one out of the way. And we realize that because we're imperfect people, and they were also driven by their worldview as things developed. And so that there was that aspect of it. And this is a little quick clip from Tom Holland himself.
The argument is not about whether God exists. It's not even about whether Christianity has been a good or bad thing, although I think that the values by which we judge whether it's good or bad are themselves broadly Christian. But this was a perspective that I was not entirely given to embracing. And that goes back essentially to my childhood, as I think for so many people's relationship to this issue does, because it's very personal. I think that in itself is a measure of how significant the influence of Christianity is on us, actually, the degree to which we are shaped by it from our childhoods. But as a child, I was brought up an Anglican. I went to church, I sang in the choir, I went to Sunday school. But to be honest, I found it kind of dull. The thing I really enjoyed, the thing that really kind of got my blood moving was the classical world. And I liked it for the same reason that I had earlier been obsessed by dinosaurs, namely that it was big, it was fierce, it was extinct. And to be honest, I would have, I was very much on the side of Pontius Pilate. The eagles, the togas, the glamour of it. And Jesus kind of slightly dull in comparison. I mean, a loser, really. And so it wasn't that there was a kind of a dramatic moment where I lost my faith. It was just like a kind of a dial going slightly down, a dimmer switch. And it was essentially blotted out by the sun of my fascination with the classical world. And so when I, in due course, came to write history, it was the Romans, it was the Greeks that I wanted to write about. But I found the experience of living in the minds of people like Caesar, people like Leonidas, the king who dies at Thermopylae, people who I had deeply admired as a child, kind of almost hero worship. I found it increasingly unsettling. Caesar was renowned among the Romans for his quality of clementia, his clemency, his mercy. But this was a man who, it is said, slaughtered 1 million Gauls and enslaved another, and was kind of cheered through the streets of Rome for it. And I began to think that actually these are so remote from me, so alien, that actually the kind of assumption I'd had that these were the seedbeds of my own values, my own assumptions, probably wrong. And so essentially over the past decade and a half, really, I've been kind of maneuvering myself towards writing a book which explores where I think ultimately the values of humanism, of secularism, of liberalism that I hold actually come from. And this was a quest that was sharpened for me by writing a book about the origins of Islam, where I was essentially making the argument that a lot that Muslims believe about the origins of Islam are actually mythic, are back projections. And it was a repeated complaint of Muslim critics that I would never dream of doing the same to my own beliefs and values. Right. So in a sense, Dominion is an attempt to do that, to kind of trace the thread back of my liberal humanist values and to see where it leads through the labyrinth. And ultimately, it leads back to Christianity. And I've come to the conclusion that in almost all the essentials, myself, my friends, the society in which I live in, the whole of the West, is so saturated in Christian assumptions that it's almost impossible to kind of remove ourselves from them.
And you say almost that in the book that it's almost that it is so widespread that we almost don't notice it. It's the kind of water we're swimming
Yeah, well,
in
the metaphor that was kind of on my mind when I was writing the book was, if the West is a goldfish bowl, then essentially the water that we swim in is Christianity. But then after I'd finished the book, another metaphor struck me when I watched the HBO series Chernobyl about the explosion of the nuclear reactor in the Soviet Union. And what you saw there, when the reactor smashes open, you literally see the air ionizing, so you can see the radioactivity leaking. But the point of the story, of course, is that radioactivity is leaking. It's reaching Kiev, it's reaching Scandinavia, it's reaching the sheep farms of Cumbria, and people are breathing it in and being affected by it, and don't even realize often that they're being affected. I mean, I'm sure Anthony would perhaps approve of the comparison of Christianity to radioactivity, but I'm not saying that Christianity makes your hair drop out and kills you, but it changes you in ways that you may not appreciate.
And just quickly sketch out why that central idea, you say this in the book, is so important. You say the belief that the Son of the one God of the Jews had been tortured to death on a cross became so enduringly and widely held that today most of us in the West are dulled to just how scandalous it originally was. Why is that image so important at the centre of Christianity?
Well, the cross today is probably the most internationally recognisable cultural symbol that humanity has ever devised. But the symbolism of it has been turned on its head. What the cross symbolized for Rome and for those who were subject to Rome was the power of the greatest empire on the face of the earth to torture to death anyone who opposed its rule. And governors of Roman provinces had the right to burn rebels, to throw them to the lions, or to crucify them. And of these three fates, crucifixion was regarded as the worst, as in a sense being the archetypal punishment for a rebellious slave. And the reason that it was so horrible was it was physically excruciating. There was no one way of doing a crucifixion. You could be hung upside down, you could be impaled, or you could have nails smashed through your bones. And to stay alive on a cross, you would have to pull yourself up and down, so you would feel the metal scraping against your bone the whole time. Birds would flock around your head. You'd be unable to beat them away. You'd be unable to stop them as they pecked out your eyes. You would be naked. And so hours, perhaps days of excruciating agony would be endured. But worse than that, from the kind of the Roman point of view, it would be public. You would be a kind of billboard advertising your own humiliation and the power of the authorities that were putting you to death. And so the idea that this symbol of all symbols should, in a sense, have kind of been upended, that from degradation, the notion of triumph, from humiliation, glory, from death, life, and that more than that, the idea that someone who suffers the death of a slave emerges to become it turns out to be, in a sense, the creator of all heaven and earth and of all humanity. What that means in the long run is that it gives a dignity to people who previously would not have been afforded dignity by anyone. It embeds at the heart of the West the idea that the victim can triumph over the person who is victimizing him, and that the lowest of the low might in a sense be the highest. And these, in the context of certainly of Roman culture, it's hard to emphasize just how radical a concept that is, and therefore just how much of a kind of a detonation it is under the assumptions of Roman power. And the measure of how vast that explosion was is that now, by and large, we tend to take for granted that the lowest of the low do have a dignity.
I come to the first point of his thesis, basically. It's a starting point of the change that came about. First of all, the cross. This was the impetus that began things. The starting point was a humble in the extreme, someone said, featuring the unlikeliest of gods to be, a pariah and a criminal executed by crucifixion, the most repellent and degrading form of punishment known in the ancient world. Something humbler is hard to imagine. And yet the executed criminal would eventually prevail and put to shame the empire that put him to death. The humblest, the utterly insignificant, masks the extraordinary results. This was an earthquake-like shock, starting a shaking of societies, values which would continue until this day. So, yeah, the symbol of the cross, was their power thing, but it turned against the Romans. As we see, the absolute worth of an individual was not the key thing, but now it became something that it was not. Crucifixion was shameful. Christians claiming Jesus was divine shattered the notion that the strong had every right to exploit the vulnerable. Since God fully identifies with their suffering, compassion and empathy was required. I'm showing here how the values we adopt and understand and know started to come into their thinking. And those are highlighted in yellow. The radical notion that weakness, suffering, and humility were divine qualities, as displayed by Jesus, subverted ancient values of admiring strength and dominance. That was the first one. The second one, Saul of Tarsus. He came into the picture. He's a big central character in this whole history of values being changed and the development of goodness in the world. He was written about by his good friend, the Dr. Greek, who I mentioned. He, Dr. Luke, had opened his first book, which was the Gospel of Luke, with these words: I'm writing for you an orderly account of what Jesus accomplished and fulfilled among us. Several eyewitnesses' biographies have already been written, using as their source material the good news preached among us by his early disciples, who were from the beginning loving servants of the Christ. Now I'm passing on to you this accurate compilation of my own meticulous investigation based on numerous eyewitness interviews. It is appropriate for me to write this, for he also appeared to me, so that I would reassure you beyond any shadow of a doubt the reliability of all you have been taught of him. That's Luke chapter 1, verse 1 and 4. And he wrote a second book, which was after that experience of the Holy Spirit, called the Book of Acts. A wonderfully exciting story of miracles and changes and unbelievable dedication of people. So what happened with Paul? Who was he? Well, he was a very dedicated Pharisee, educated to the nth degree in the Torah, front and back, was absolutely infuriated by this heresy being preached in his own city, in Jerusalem. And he got wild and appointed himself as the destroyer of the Christians. The first martyr was Stephen, stoned to death. He was standing by, supporting people during the stoning. He cleared, they said he was in houses, going in there, pulling people out of the houses, and men, women and children, throwing them into jail. When he'd done a good enough job, he thought in Jerusalem he'd head for Damascus. There was a group of these nasty people up there. So he got an authorized written permission from the Sanhedrin, and off he went. So not long after that, he's outside the city with his servers. He was a senior fellow. And let me read from the story of Luke. Just outside the city, a brilliant light flashed from heaven, suddenly exploded all around him. Falling to the ground, he heard a booming voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" The men accompanying Saul were stunned and speechless, for they heard a heavenly voice but could not see anyone. Saul replied, "Who are you, Lord?" And the reply, "I am Jesus, the victorious, the one you are persecuting. Now get up and go into the city where you will be told what you are to do." Saul stood to his feet, and even though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. He was blind. Men had to take him by the hand and lead him to Damascus. He collapsed there, literally shaken beyond measure, didn't know whether he was coming or going. And at the same time, a man called Ananias was spoken to by God, who said, "I want you to go and pray for Saul of Tarsus." And the shock, was just too much. He said, "No, I can't do that. This man's coming to destroy us. He's known for his brutality. What's going on?" And he got the answer. "Listen, get up and go. Get on your bicycle. I've chosen this man as my special messenger to take the revelation of who I am to many nations and the Jewish people." So Ananias went, prayed for him. His eyes were opened. He actually had a meal then. And the very next day he was out preaching that Jesus was the Lord of heaven. And he never stopped for the next 40-something years. And he did go to all the nations, because that was his special calling. He had this education in Greek, and he could relate to people right through the empire. He was the man chosen, and therefore he had a very dramatic conversion, which he never doubted ever again, as many of us have had. Totally transformed after an encounter with God, who named himself as Jesus. He obeyed that call. He traveled the known world, 3 major missionary journeys by foot, taking months at a time to get around that area. And he established initially small, almost insignificant groups of Christians, churches, but many of them were influential people, educated people, and they became the leaders of the church in the first century. It wasn't a religion, for the peasants. They were there too. Persecution increased and antagonism to Christians grew because of all this, and he had to flee a number of times. He was shipwrecked twice, given 39 lashes by opposition groups. 39 lashes. Was stoned to death once, but raised up after prayer from his followers. He was in times of great danger, hunger, extreme cold. He worked as a tent maker when he had to. He kept on the road for more strange places ever ahead. Cities like Corinth, Ephesus, Galatia, Philippi, most of them in modern-day Turkey and Greece, all through dangers from bandits, etc. on the roads. He had a goal for Spain next, which never happened, because he obeyed God and went back to Jerusalem when everyone said this is going to end very badly for you. And the result was then he went in chains to Rome itself. There he converted most of the Praetorian Guard in the prison and encouraged believers around the Roman Empire through his letters. By tradition, he died by crucifixion, and most likely in the great persecution by Nero after the fire which he blamed on the Christians for the great fire of Rome. Also, the Apostle Peter, the first bishop of Rome, was crucified upside down in the same gory way at that time. He wrote 7 major letters, penned between 45 AD and 70 AD. They've dated those now. All the scholars realize those were written very, very early after Jesus' time. Paul's letters to churches in these main centers of faith, Holland describes as the most influential, the most transformative, the most revolutionary ever written. Paul's theological vision as a metaphorical depth charge, placed under the foundations of the classical pagan world, the ripples of which will shape Western values today, still shape them. Of course, they were based and combined with the gospel accounts of Jesus' life. Holland gives a deep and depth analysis for all of that. And you'd have to read the book, because I don't have a lot of time left to tell you about it. So there was a great shift through Paul. And that was, Paul took Jesus' teachings, applied it to everyone, everywhere. By declaring neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, Paul asserted that all peoples have equal value, and this disruptive, radical idea planted the seeds for the modern concept of universal human rights. He taught that sexuality should be regulated by consent and moral purity, not by power. What else was happening in Rome? Well, women were flocking to the church because they found a group of people who valued them. Influential people joined. Christians were gaining an amazing reputation for compassionate acts, which impressed the locals through plagues, many plagues. And, there was a frustrated later announcement from the emperor about the pesky Christians who are showing us up badly, because we just abandoned our plague families. They were so scared of it. They'd literally leave them to starve and die on their own. And Christians in the neighborhood would come and stay with them and hold them, and often caught the plague and died themselves, many of them. And so that example was catching on. And after Peter and others, the church in Rome came through periods of intense persecution. Nero just loved torture. They're just too awful to imagine, but I'll tell you one, Nero got them covered in pitch, alive, and lit them in the night so they could light up the streets, and he lined them up against posts. The whole street was lit with burning Christians. They put animal skins on them and set them before wild dogs to be chewed upon. The lions tearing Christians apart in the Colosseum were accompanied by crowds roaring their approval at the exciting bloodlust that they were being fed. It was not a time to be preaching the gospel, but they continued to do just that. There's a lot of suffering in the world. We won't go there, but, one point that people can't understand. God is love. Why does he allow all this stuff? Well, he didn't create a second heaven on earth. There wouldn't have been a point, would there? There's only one heaven where there's nothing like that. There's some other reasons, and they're very helpful things we can talk about. Then we come to the next one, and these are going to go quite quickly. Polycarp, the Bishop of Smyrna. He's quite famous because, guess what? He was a friend of the Apostle John. And was mentored by him, actually. And he was mentoring a man called Irenaeus. And Irenaeus reported in writing, we have the writings, how Polycarp would sit with him and tell him about his conversations that he'd had with the Apostle John, what his Jesus' teachings were, what he'd said to them, what he'd done in terms of miracles and so on. And he would tell it more than once. This was an important thing in his life. And it was pretty well memorized. And Irenaeus was very impressed and believed it totally, because he trusted this man as a man of honesty, as they all were, these good leaders. And so what had been accomplished in the early years of the church? We had the values of the Roman things. Now we see a different paradigm. Look at the ones on the right compared to the ones on the left. Because God chose the foolish, weak, and despised things of the world to shame the weak and strong. The crucifixion was shameful, agonizing execution reserved for slaves was transformed into an ultimate triumph. Every baby is made in the image of God. Exposing children is condemned as murder. Slaves and masters possess equal spiritual dignity. Both are brothers and sisters in Christ. That's what Paul said. He didn't say slavery is wrong. He said you must treat your slaves right. They're just human as you and have dignity. He couldn't go as far as, speaking out against slavery. That would have brought the powers of hell upon the church that was young and fragile. And so he was certainly wanting a whole different attitude to slaves. Status of women, they really were given status even in those early days of the church. Many of the leaders were. One was named as an apostle by the Apostle Paul. And many times he was congratulating them for all their work and effort in the ministry. And then charity and welfare. Charity became a moral duty directed to the poor and disadvantaged and viewed as serving Christ himself. Leaders and the wealthy obligated to serve the people, not vice versa. So those were the changes that had come about. And that went on till the next phase, and that was Constantine, emperor for 4 years. His mother helped introduce him to Christ. He became a firm believer, and he made persecution illegal of the Christians, and he helped the church quite significantly in a short time. The shift was, Christianity was made the state religion, and that had negative as well as positive complex. So it had imperial backing which stopped the worst persecution, but that local persecution all over that empire continued. People were very superstitious. They came up with these horrible things about Christians, that they ate babies and drank their blood and, oh God, awful rubbish. And mobs would often attack the churches and, kill people and ruin them. And then, because it was a state church, it began to attract power-hungry people who ruined its positive impact and reputation over a few centuries. They got into appointing political friends as the bishops, who were then governing areas of the empire. So it was all mixed up. So the relative peace and safety of the Roman Empire have made it possible for travel and spreading the good news. Pope Gregory brought out the papal reform, which in the 11th century said, this is wrong, we've got to get it right. And he then, managed to formulate the laws of governance and arrangement so that as we read here, he sought to free itself from secular control. The temporal power of the state needed to be distinct from the church. By separating these things, this laid the bedrock for the future development of Western secularization. In other words, people could believe what they wanted, and they could be secular and do their thing, and the Christians could do their thing. And that was healthy. You can't force people to do and proclaim to believe something they don't. And so this birthed a new concept in the world, religion as an independent sphere of life. Then the biggest next one was introduced by Martin Luther in the 16th century. He challenged the Catholic establishment, rejected their unbiblical dogma. He emphasized individual conscience, Bible literacy, and personal prayer. This democratized access to the divine. Previously, it was all you had to go through the priest for your prayers, for your forgiveness, for your permission to read the Bible. The ordinary people were not allowed to read the Bible. They had to do it through the priest. The widespread elevation of personal faith and relationship with God through Jesus Christ above institutional hierarchy eventually accelerated the Western turn towards modern individualism and freedom of thought. Values we hold dearly. William Wilberforce was the next shift, well, because he led it, the abolition movement of slavery in the 18th century, 19th century. 3 of these ancient bishops in the 400s and 300s had written treatises saying slavery is fundamentally wrong. Of course, it didn't go anywhere. The whole economy of the world ran on free labor, and so it was not well received right through until this 1300 years later. Major moral pivot came driven primarily by evangelical and Quakers, the conviction to end slave trade. They mobilized the biblical concept that all humans are made in the image of God to argue that slavery was a profound moral abomination. And after 40 years of intense lobbying in Britain, it stopped. This helped establish the modern secular consensus that crimes against humanity are universal wrongs. And just very quickly, other major improvements in compassionate action introduced into law and society in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Christians lobbied for, and these were specific people I have in mind, prison reform, public hospitals, education as a right for all, reduced working hours, increased minimum ages for children to be employed. Those were the key ones that came about in this very short space of 100 years, in terms of tens of thousands of years of history, vast improvements in conditions for all of us. And the Enlightenment came as a bit of an opposition in the 18th century, and these philosophers sought to rationalize an understanding of the universe and define values but separate from the church, which they saw as outmoded and restrictive of human development. Concepts of universal human rights and justice, compassion, empathy, fairness, and fundamental dignity of the individual were actually carried forward by them based on long-established Christian values, which they had inherited. It had become their worldview already. They saw it as, well, this is what we are. This is the right thing to do, and we'll improve on what's there. They were, in effect, cultural Christians, as we all are. We live in a fishbowl, which is sort of all based on these original ideas from Christ. And this movement initiated modern secular ideologies like liberalism and humanism. And the modern secular movements that we now have, the shift, the rise of science, evolution theory, atheism, radically changed popular belief in the Bible. Holland argues convincingly that even post-Christian secular movements like socialism, feminism, modern human rights activism are also directly inheriting these foundational concepts of the poor shall inherit the earth and equality and rights of all people. Yes, and as far as the Enlightenment, there's strong sense from some of them that this would have all happened anyway. It started with the Stoics and Greek, and there were positive aspects of that, and would have developed, which Holland, I think, undercuts with his very clear arguments. But his chief kind of opponent currently is a man called Grayling. He's written a book. Henry gave it to me. It's an interesting read from a different concept, different angle. And I did see an interview, and he asked Holland, he said, so give me one thing that's unique that Christians introduced. I can't think of any. I had it in my pocket, actually, the answer to that. And Holland said, well, for example, marriage to one person for life. For example, the whole concept of religion and secularisms come from that. There's the other important ones. Where did my jacket go, Ben?
Chair.
Cheer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good to see it. You're nearly there. You're very patient, folks. Here we go. There we go. Oh, the concept that everyone has dignity. The concept that the secular must be separate from religion. The marriage one I've mentioned, and the idea to choose, who you want to marry. All of these things have developed through those Christian ideals. Henry and I will talk more. International progress in this century, taking it wider than the Western world, much wider. Relevant treaties and declarations from the United Nations and European Union have been signed by the vast majority of world leaders. They include Declaration of Human Rights, the Declaration of the Protection of the Indigenous People. Now, we all know that this doesn't get perfectly implemented, but they're certainly saying, many, many nations, yes, this is the right thing to do. This is what we should have. They were viewed as principles and targets to aim for. Christian values have endured and become accepted as the way forward for humanity to live well. Modern missionary efforts, in case you're interested. Every country in the world has Christian believers. China officially says 40 million. At least 110 million is the true figure. Despite the ongoing oppression today and persecution, that's about 7% of their population in a communist nation. South Korea was a tiny 1% 120 years ago. It's now 31%. Indonesia, a Muslim nation, the largest in the world. Christian population has grown from 10% in 2000 to about 20% now, and the Muslim government is voicing concerns. It has a very appeal to many people I'm talking about, and it works for many, many people. Iran is rapidly growing numbers. Christianity has the most rapid growth of all religions, and the total current number is about 2.3 to 2.4 billion, which is 31% of the world's population. And I'm going to finish because I did say I just mentioned threats to modern democracy, our values. I'm just saying our values because democracy incorporates, good democracy incorporates these things. And I see, and I've heard a lecture by this, so I'm just quoting, being right of centre, especially with focusism of racism, leads to authoritarian leadership. The playbook for these power-hungry people is find an enemy that you can direct fear and hate towards. You're seeing that in the States, if anyone is weak. You're seeing it in Germany, the Jews. You're seeing it in Ukraine by Putin. It's the Ukrainians. They've stolen our land. They're horrible people. And, it gets to the extreme and it's fascism. And that was what happened in Germany, and it ended up in a Holocaust. We can vote for right-wing parties, as is being very popular now around the world, the Western world, Hungary, and France, and Australia, and Hansen. And people want hard leadership, good decision-making, keep us safe, deal with the rubbish, the rebel, and they vote for it. And you get back something that you don't want in the end if you go too far. Beware the popular way society is going. Hungary was very far down. He was almost going to declare dictatorship just this year. They woke up because he was supporting Putin, and that woke up the Hungarians. Even though we've got safety, this is not good. There's something deeply wrong. And they voted him out, despite Trump sending his gang to support him. Left of centre, suppression of thoughts, debate and media, and education institutions. This is a danger. Over issues that are not acceptable by the majority of people. The majority of us don't like you to say, I'm black, or you mustn't say I'm black. And use another term. And if you do say it, with the subjective laws that they're trying to bring in. There's some New Zealand now, and it's like this already in other countries. Then that's going to be classed as hate speech because you've offended someone. So hate is suddenly now you've offended someone. It's a very different thing, isn't it? I have a different opinion to you. You can take offense at that, but I'm not hating. I'm just expressing my opinion. It's not unkindness to have a different opinion. And then there's this subjective truth that people, your truth is it's true. If you believe it, it's true. Anyone can believe anything. It's nonsense. Truth is truth. And this is coming into society. And it's kind of promoted by the extreme left. I'll tell you a little story. The New Zealand police, they're drafting these new hate speech laws. They're very clear ones already. They've been arresting people based on their understanding of what was offensive. The Free Speech Union have called them out, taken them to task legally. They had to do it legally. And it's ended up, the police said, we're sorry, we've gone too far. We interpreted this very liberally, taking people off the streets and protesting with a placard, in favor of something that the majority of the population doesn't like. Peacefully holding a placard. Handcuffed it in New Zealand. And it's worrying, and it's something that will affect our democracy if it goes too far left. And the end of that is Big Brother and communism. Atheism may contribute to some individuals ignoring their conscience and moral codes, the social disruption causing the nation cost and fostering a form of anarchy. That's extreme, and it would be unusual. You've seen right-wing anarchy. Can you believe they spent $800,000 of our money for this mass killer of 76 fellow citizens? Not on a trial, on an appeal against his sentence. $500,000 in legal aid to this vile criminal. This is wokeism gone too far, extreme left stuff, and they probably had to do it legally, but they need to tighten up. And on that note, I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope it was interesting for some who didn't know some of these things, why we are today in our thinking, what we admire, what we hope to be, and what we can be with help from different quarters, whatever you may think of those. So God bless you and have a nice day. Bye-bye.